The cold air of early morning touched Elijah Kane's skin as he stepped out of his small ranch house. The sky was still dark, but a pale line of light was beginning to stretch across the horizon. This was his favorite hour of the day, quiet, still, and filled with the soft sound of the desert waking up. The land around him was wide and open, stretching farther than the eye could see, with dry grass waving gently in the breeze and distant hills fading into the gray-blue morning. He rubbed his hands together and walked toward the barn. His boots made a steady crunching sound on the dirt path, a sound he knew so well after years of living alone out here. Elijah was not a young man anymore, but he was strong and calm, a man who liked things simple. Every morning he checked on his horses before sunrise. He liked to feed them, talk to them a little, and then get ready for a day of hard work on the ranch. But that morning would not be like the others. Something felt different. The air itself seemed heavier, as if it was holding its breath. As he approached the barn, Elijah noticed that the door was not fully closed. It was just slightly open, enough to move gently with the wind and make a soft creaking sound. He paused for a second. He was sure he had closed it the night before. He always did. He was a careful man, especially since the ranch stood far from town. Wild animals sometimes wandered close, and strangers too. Elijah lifted the lantern in his hand and stepped closer. His old dog, Buck, followed quietly behind, his ears perked up. The dog was alert, sensing something unusual too. Elijah pushed the barn door open. It gave a louder creak this time, and the sound echoed through the quiet morning. The light from his lantern spilled across the barn floor, and that was when Elijah froze. There, on the straw-covered ground between the horse stalls, were 5 figures, 5 young women. They were kneeling close together, their heads lowered, their long dark hair falling over their shoulders. Their feet were bare and dusty, their clothes worn and torn at the edges. Their faces were tired, and their arms wrapped around themselves as if they were trying to keep warm. The scene felt unreal, like something out of a story, not his quiet, simple life. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. For a moment he didn't move at all. His first thought was that maybe they were lost travelers or people who needed help. But something about the way they sat, silent, still, with lowered eyes, told him their night had not been a peaceful one. The oldest among them, maybe in her 20s, slowly lifted her face to look at him. Her dark eyes met his, deep, tired, but strong. The look wasn't one of anger or fear exactly. It was more like a silent question. What will you do? Elijah lowered the lantern a little so the light was softer. The horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, sensing the strange presence. Buck stood at Elijah's side but did not bark. The barn felt both quiet and full at the same time, as if every breath could be heard. "Morning," Elijah said softly, though he knew they might not understand. His voice was calm, low, as if speaking too loud would break something delicate in the air. None of the women spoke, but the oldest one raised a hand slightly, not in warning but in a small, careful movement that showed she understood he meant no harm. Elijah stepped closer, slowly, so they would not be frightened. He could now see more details in the dim light. Their clothes were simple, made from cloth and leather, but they were dusty from travel. Their faces were marked not with cruelty, but with the weariness of a long, hard journey. He saw scratches on their arms, dirt on their knees, and the way their shoulders trembled from exhaustion and cold. It was then Elijah realized who they were. He had lived near Apache lands for many years. He recognized their features, their traditional clothing. These were Apache women, and they had come here on foot, through rough land in the middle of the night. Questions rushed through Elijah's mind. Where had they come from? Why were they here? Were they in danger? Were they running from someone? He didn't know, but one thing was clear. They were tired, frightened, and alone. He slowly lowered the lantern to a nail on the wall, letting its light spread through the barn more gently. Then he crouched down a few steps away from them, keeping a respectful distance. His movements were slow and quiet, like someone trying not to startle a horse. "You're safe here," he said quietly. He didn't know if they understood English, but he hoped they could hear the kindness in his voice. One of the younger women, maybe 16 or 17, pressed her hands tighter together, looking down. Another shifted her weight slightly, as if her legs hurt from kneeling. Elijah noticed their bare feet were red from the cold and covered in dust. They had walked a long way. He stood up and walked toward a wooden shelf near the corner of the barn. There he kept some old blankets and cloth. He picked a few up and carefully laid them on the ground near the women. He didn't push them toward them, just placed them within reach and then stepped back again. For a few long seconds, nothing happened. Then slowly the oldest woman reached out and touched one of the blankets. She hesitated as if waiting to see if he would react, but Elijah didn't move. She then pulled it gently toward herself and wrapped it around her shoulders. One by one, the others followed. It wasn't much, but it gave them warmth. Elijah's heart felt heavy but also steady. These were human beings, cold and tired, sitting in his barn. He didn't need to know their full story to see that they needed kindness. He poured some water from the tin jug into a small bucket and set it down near them. Again, no words, just simple gestures. This time they didn't hesitate as long. They passed the water carefully, letting the youngest drink first. Outside, the first light of the sun was starting to touch the land. It painted the edges of the barn door gold. Elijah could hear the distant call of a bird, a soft reminder that life moved on even in strange moments like this. As the light grew stronger, Elijah saw more signs that told a quiet story. The youngest woman's hands were shaking as she held the bucket. Another had a small cut on her forehead, now dried but still visible. Their hair was messy, like they had traveled through the brush in a hurry. And their eyes carried the weight of something they had endured. Elijah leaned against a post, his mind turning. He knew the world outside his ranch was not kind to these women. There was tension between settlers and Apache people. He had seen it himself. Many people around here saw differences first, not humanity. But Elijah had never been that way. He believed in judging people by their actions, not by their name or where they came from. And right now what he saw were 5 people who had come seeking shelter. He took a slow breath and spoke softly again. "You can stay here for now," he said, more to himself than to them. "You're safe." They didn't answer in words, but something shifted in the air. The oldest woman's shoulders relaxed just a little. The others looked up for the first time, meeting his gaze carefully. Trust wasn't built in an instant, but something like it began to grow there. Small, quiet, but real. Elijah decided to keep them hidden in the barn for the time being. He didn't know who might come looking for them or why, but he knew enough to understand that letting anyone else know too soon could bring trouble, for them and for him. He moved around the barn, checking the horses, trying to act like everything was normal, but his thoughts were far from his daily routine. The ranch had always been a quiet, simple place. That morning it had become something else entirely. A shelter, maybe even a crossing point of 2 very different worlds. The women huddled together, whispering softly in their own language. The sound was gentle, almost like the wind moving through leaves. Elijah didn't understand the words, but he could hear their tiredness and their hope. He walked back to the house and brought out some bread and dried fruit from the kitchen. He placed the food near them and stepped back again. They looked at him, then at the food, unsure at first. But when the oldest woman gave a small nod, the others slowly began to eat. The sun rose higher. The barn filled with warm light, softening the hard edges of the night before. Elijah stood by the open door looking out at the land. He knew this quiet moment wouldn't last forever. Someone might come asking questions. Someone might have seen something. But for now he had made a choice, to offer shelter, not turn away. As the horses shifted and snorted softly in their stalls, Elijah turned back to look at the women. They were still sitting close together, wrapped in the blankets he had given them, their heads resting on each other's shoulders, tired but safe for now. And that, he thought, was enough. The morning had started like any other. A cold walk to the barn, the soft sound of boots on dirt. But in that single moment when he opened the door, Elijah Kane's life had changed, and though he did not yet know it, the quiet choice he made that morning would echo far beyond his ranch. Elijah stood at the doorway of the barn as the sun slowly climbed higher into the bright blue sky. Warm light spilled over the dry land, turning the golden grass into a sea of color. His horses shifted softly in their stalls, the old wooden boards creaking beneath their hooves. It should have been a quiet morning like any other, but everything felt different now. Inside the barn were 5 Apache women who had appeared in the night like a silent storm, barefoot, tired, and uncertain of their future. The ranch had always belonged to Elijah and his father before him. It was a place of hard work, calm evenings, and predictable days. But life had its way of changing without warning. He took a slow breath, trying to clear his mind, but questions kept filling his head. Who were these women? Where had they come from? And most importantly, what would happen if others found out they were here? He turned and looked back inside the barn. The women were still wrapped in the old blankets he had given them. Their faces looked softer now in the warm light, less tense than they had at dawn. One of them, the youngest, was fast asleep with her head on another's shoulder. The oldest woman sat upright, her dark eyes fixed on Elijah. She didn't speak, but her gaze carried a quiet strength. She was watching him. Not with fear now, but with careful hope. Elijah walked to the well outside and filled a tin bucket with fresh water. When he returned to the barn, he placed it gently on the ground. The oldest woman nodded slightly, a silent thank you. Elijah answered with a small nod of his own. Words weren't needed to understand something so simple. Kindness was being shared. As the morning passed, Elijah went about his chores, feeding the horses, checking the fences, and tending to the chicken coop, but his mind was never far from the barn. He knew the land well, and he knew people too. The small town nearby wasn't far, and word traveled fast in such places. If someone came asking, things could turn difficult. Many people out there didn't understand, and they didn't always choose kindness. But Elijah was a man who believed in doing what felt right, not what was easy. And this, offering these women a safe place to rest, felt right deep in his chest. When he returned to the barn again around midday, the women were sitting more comfortably. The youngest was now awake, rubbing her eyes sleepily. The others spoke softly to one another in their own language. Their words flowed gently like a stream, rising and falling in quiet tones. Elijah didn't understand what they were saying, but the way they spoke to each other told him something important. They trusted one another completely. They were a family or something close to it. Elijah pulled up a wooden crate and sat a little distance away from them. He reached into his pocket and took out a small piece of cornbread he had brought from the house. He broke it into smaller pieces and placed them on the ground near them. One by one, the women took the pieces carefully, their hands still hesitant but no longer shaking. The sun was high now. The sound of the wind passing through the grass was soft and steady. For a few moments the world felt calm, but that calm was like the still air before a storm. Deep down, Elijah knew this peace might not last long. By early afternoon, the sound of distant horses broke the quiet. Elijah lifted his head sharply. He recognized that sound too well. Riders. More than one. He stepped outside, squinting toward the open field. A thin line of dust was rising far down the dirt road. 3 riders were approaching his ranch, their shapes growing clearer with each passing second. Elijah felt his chest tighten. He turned back to the barn and saw the oldest woman's eyes watching him again. She didn't know what he had heard, but she saw the change in his face. In a low, steady voice, Elijah whispered, "Stay quiet. Don't come out." He didn't know if she understood the words, but she understood the tone. She gave a single sharp nod. The other women huddled closer together like birds in a nest, silent and still. Elijah closed the barn door carefully but left it unlocked, then walked toward the front of the ranch. His dog Buck followed close behind, tail stiff. The riders reached the gate a few minutes later. They were 3 men from town, men Elijah recognized. Their faces were rough from the sun, their clothes dusty from the road. They dismounted their horses, and the man in the middle, tall and broad-shouldered, called out, "Morning, Cain," the man said. "You seen anything strange last night?" Elijah kept his voice calm. "Morning. Oh, nothing out of the ordinary." The man glanced around the property slowly, his eyes scanning the barn, the corral, the open field. "Word is," he continued, "some Apache women were seen near the river last night. We're riding out to find them. Can't have people just wandering around here." Elijah felt the words hit him like a cold wind. His heartbeat grew louder in his ears, but he kept his face steady. "No one's come through here," he said simply. The man looked at him, searching his face for a sign. Elijah didn't flinch. He had always been a man of few words, and today silence was his best shield. One of the other riders leaned forward on the fence, peering toward the barn. "Mind if we take a look around?" he asked. That question hung in the air like a heavy weight. Elijah knew this was the moment. If they went into the barn, they would find the women. And once they did, nothing good would follow. The women trusted him, even without words. and now it was up to him to protect that trust. He stepped forward slowly but firmly, blocking their view of the barn. "You know this land's mine," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "Ain't nothing in that barn but horses and feed. You won't find anything here." The tall man's eyes narrowed slightly. For a long moment no one spoke. The wind carried a soft whistle through the grass. The men weren't used to Elijah standing in their way like this, but they also knew he wasn't the kind of man to be pushed around easily. Finally, the tall man clicked his tongue and stepped back. "All right then," he said. "But if you see anything, you let us know." "Sure," Elijah replied simply. The men mounted their horses again. Dust rose behind them as they rode off down the road. Elijah stood still, watching until the dust disappeared into the horizon. Only when the sound of hooves faded did he let out the breath he'd been holding. He turned and walked quickly back to the barn. When he opened the door, 5 pairs of eyes were waiting for him, wide, anxious, but trusting. He didn't need to explain what had happened. They had heard the voices outside. They had felt the tension. Elijah knelt down a little, placing a hand over his chest and then pointing toward them. "Safe," he said softly. "You're safe." The oldest woman gave him a look he would never forget. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but full of quiet gratitude. She didn't need to speak for him to understand what it meant. That evening, the ranch was painted gold and orange by the sunset. Elijah sat outside, leaning against the wooden post by the barn. The women were still inside, resting now. He could hear soft humming. One of them was singing a gentle tune. It floated through the warm air like a soft ribbon, touching the quiet land around them. He thought about what had happened that day. He could have turned them away. He could have let those riders search. It would have been easier, safer, but easy wasn't always right. He had chosen to stand in front of his barn, steady as a rock, and protect 5 people who had no one else to stand for them. That choice might bring trouble later. He knew that. But when he thought of the look in their eyes, that fragile trust, he knew he wouldn't change his decision. As night fell, Elijah brought out more food and water. The women accepted it, and this time they didn't hesitate. They sat together, closer to him now. The oldest woman gestured gently with her hand, touching her chest and then pointing at him. Elijah understood. She was saying thank you, not in words, but in a way more powerful than words. They stayed on his ranch for several days. Elijah helped them heal, gave them a place to rest, and kept watch over the road. Each day they grew a little stronger. The fear in their eyes slowly softened, replaced with quiet determination. One morning before the sun rose, they prepared to leave. It was time for them to continue their journey. The oldest woman walked up to Elijah, holding a small woven bracelet made of thin grass and string. She placed it gently in his hand and closed his fingers around it. No words. Just a gift, a piece of their gratitude he would carry with him. Elijah nodded, his throat tight. He watched as the 5 women walked into the early morning light, their figures growing smaller with each step until they disappeared into the wide desert. When they were gone, the ranch felt quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It was a quiet that held a story inside it, a story that would never be written in books or carved into stone, but would live in Elijah Kane's heart for the rest of his life. He looked down at the bracelet in his hand. It was small and simple, but to him it was more valuable than anything else he owned. It was a reminder of a moment when doing the right thing had been louder than fear. As the sun rose once more over the endless land, Elijah went back to work. The horses needed feeding. The fences needed fixing. Life went on. But deep down, he knew that he had been a part of something bigger than his quiet ranch, and no matter how many years would pass, that morning and those 5 women and would never leave his memory.